I'm pleased to introduce our speaker today. Dan Ammann was named president of General Motors in January of 2014. He is responsible for managing the company's business operations around the world, the global Chevrolet and Cadillac brand organizations, global product planning, new business development, as well as GM Financial. Previously, he worked as Executive Vice President and Chief Financial Officer since April of 2011, where he led a transformation of GM's financial operations. He was appointed chair of the board of Shanghai General Motors, GM's largest Chinese joint venture, in February of 2014. Before joining GM, Mr. Ammann was managing director and head of industrial investment banking for Morgan Stanley, where he was instrumental in advising GM during its 2009 restructuring. He currently serves as a member of the board of directors of Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Company and Lyft Incorporated. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dan Ammann.
Thank you very much to Keith Cardoza and everyone at the Economic Club of Chicago for hosting this event, and thanks in particular to the Auto Alliance for sponsoring this lunch today. Before I begin, on behalf of the senior leadership and frankly everybody at General Motors, I'd like to express our condolences to the family and friends of Jim Matea, as well as to his colleagues at the Tribune, Mama, and throughout the automotive press. Jim was a fixture on the auto beat for a long time, so long in fact that one of the first stories he ever did about General Motors had a headline that said, "Vega sales to surpass Pinto." Jim was one of the smartest, the fairest, and the most respected journalists in the field, and he's sorely missed already. As those of you who knew him can attest, the Chicago Auto Show will not be the same without him. Today, I'd like to talk with you about the future, especially as it relates to General Motors and to Chicago. Last year, as you might know, Mayor Emanuel launched the city vision in Chicago of Zero Vision Chicago. This is a data-driven, multi-agency approach to improving traffic safety for all citizens, whether they be in vehicles, on bikes, or on foot. Vision Zero will reduce the number of roadway crashes with the goal of eliminating traffic fatalities and serious injuries in Chicago by 2026. At General Motors, we have similar plans and goals, and we think that we can help. We're transforming the company to be at the forefront of change in this industry as the future rapidly approaches. And we have a two-part strategy to do so. Firstly, to strengthen and grow our core business of building and selling great cars, trucks, and crossovers. And secondly, to define and lead the future of personal mobility through the creation of an entirely new transportation business model. Our core business is strong and getting even stronger. The evidence is in our record profits for 2016, where we made more than $12 billion pre-tax, or as I like to think about it in simple terms, about $1 billion a month. And it's in the vehicles on the show floor at Cadillac, Chevrolet, Buick, and GMC. The evidence is also on the road, especially here in Chicago, which is traditionally a very strong market for General Motors and for Chevrolet in particular. And we'd like to thank all of our tremendous Chicagoland dealers for that, because without them, this wouldn't be possible. 2016 marked the 6th consecutive year that Chevrolet has been the market leader in Chicago. The Chevy Malibu is the best-selling midsize sedan in town, and 10 other Chevrolet models were leading in their segments. And as we look to the future for Chicago and elsewhere, our plan for it is much like Vision Zero's. And we intend to get there while building vehicles that are cleaner, smarter, safer, and more energy efficient than ever. At General Motors today, we find ourselves at the intersection of the one hand of having this huge business that's running very successfully, and on the other hand, trying to make sure that we're best positioning our company for the future. For more than a century, our business has been centered on selling cars to individuals, hoping they have a great experience, and that a few years later they will come back, trade their car in, and buy another one. That model is changing. One of the fundamental drivers of the high cost of car ownership is the very low utilization rate. If you live here in the city and you buy a nice car for $50,000 or $60,000 and you pay $1,000 a month to park it, just to have it sit in that parking lot 95% of the time and depreciate, you can understand that that's not a very good economic utilization model. Ride sharing solves a big problem of that model because it significantly increases the utilization of the asset, which changes the economics of getting from point A to point B. Another important development is the ubiquity of the mobile device, which has created a significant opportunity cost for the time that you spend driving. So instead of driving in traffic, I can be doing something else, like doing emails, working, and so on. These two factors together, the high cost of ownership and the high cost of my time lost while driving, are a couple of the forces that are changing the whole consumption model around car-based transportation. So we look at that and we ask ourselves, how will this evolve in the future? If you take the rideshare model and you combine it with rapidly developing autonomous vehicle technology, eventually that very high cost of transportation can come down further and utilization will rise. That's why we have put ourselves at the forefront of this trend. We've invested in Lyft, and we acquired Cruise Automation, a San Francisco-based autonomous vehicle startup with extraordinarily deep software talent and rapid development capability. With Cruise inside of the GM fold, we have accelerated our progress. We've begun testing a fleet of Chevrolet Bolt EV autonomous vehicles in 3 different states. The new Bolt EV, as you may have heard, is an absolute game changer. It's an affordable electric vehicle with 238 miles of range, room for 5 adults, and all of their belongings. The Bolt EV is built on a dedicated electrical vehicle architecture, and it's much more than just an electric car. It is, in our view, a foundation for an electric, autonomous, ride-sharing future. We're putting the autonomous Bolt through a demanding testing program, and we're doing it with safety being absolutely top of mind. That's why we haven't put any members of the public into our vehicles yet. When we do customer research, safety is the first concern that comes back with regard to autonomous vehicles. We want them to be absolutely ready, safe enough to put our own children into, and that's why we're testing so rigorously. At some point, and it's going to be sooner than most people think, we will deploy our autonomous vehicles, still with a backup driver, into a rideshare fleet. At that point, people can get into them. We'll use that fleet to accumulate all the data we need to convince ourselves and regulators that we're ready to go fully driverless. Last month, I showed video footage to investors of a ride I took with our Cruise Automation team in an autonomous Bolt EV in San Francisco. Today, with all of you, I would like to share more of our progress. I'm going to show you a time-lapse video of a 23-minute drive, so it's not going to take 23 minutes to go through, on public streets in a very complex driving environment. This drive, as you will see, was done with 0 driver takeovers, and you'll be able to see that by watching footage of the steering wheel in the lower left corner. So pay special attention to a couple things in the video. You can look out for them. The Bolt AV navigates through several construction zones. Keep in mind the complexity of managing that in an ever-changing construction landscape. You'll see a pedestrian during the drive who jaywalks safely, thanks to the technology in the car. And a few minutes in, you'll see an intersection where we're behind a vehicle waiting to make a left turn and another car cuts in front of us, but the autonomous vehicle navigates all of that fully safely. You'll also see a biker who cuts us off, and you'll see a double parked truck that we navigate our way around. So that's all normal, everyday activity on the streets of San Francisco. We couldn't reach the level of competency that you will see in this footage in such complicated situations if we were testing just in a suburban environment or if we were testing just on our proving grounds. So you can see the technology is very real, it's moving very quickly, and it can soon be a real commercial reality. Our real-world autonomous vehicle testing program started in California and Arizona. It's now expanded to Michigan when the state legislature recently approved that. Here in Illinois, a bipartisan group of lawmakers in Springfield is working on legislation to make the deployment of self-driving cars a reality in this city and in the state. We're encouraged by the work of Senators Sandoval, Harmon, and McConaughey, as well as Representatives Zaleski and Demmer. We look forward to working with local governments to deploy self-driving cars in the safest way possible. In addition to advancing safety, self-driving cars have the potential to reduce congestion, supplement Chicago's public transit system, provide connectivity between downtown and the suburbs, and facilitate a system of doorstep-to-doorstep mobility for elderly and disabled residents. As I said, to make autonomous vehicles the best they can be and the safest they can be, we really need to be testing on public streets. It can be limited to a geofenced area, but it needs to be on public streets in a real-world environment like what you just saw in the video. It's important this gets done because autonomous vehicles can provide many benefits to society in terms of safety, convenience, and quality of life. A recent study I saw suggested that 30% of all vehicles driving on city streets are actually people looking for a parking spot. And so there's your convenience and quality of life improvement right there. More important, of course, is safety. In 2015, traffic accidents cost more than 35,000 lives in the United States, which was the largest percentage increase year over year in half a century. It's estimated that well more than 90% of these accidents were caused by human error, errors that autonomous driving has the potential to eliminate. While this transition to autonomous takes hold, we're taking other actions to address the changing nature of vehicle ownership. These actions include the Cadillac Book program that we're launching in New York. For $1,500 a month, instead of having only one vehicle for the life of the lease, Cadillac owners can have their choice of vehicles and continually switch between them. And it's convenient. The vehicle they select will be delivered to their door with white glove concierge service. So they can drive an SUV all winter, a performance sedan in the summer. They can have a CT6 during the week or take an Escalade for a weekend trip to the Hamptons or to Vermont. So that's just one example of us moving toward a new transportation model. In addition, about a year ago, we launched Maven, a unique car-sharing concept as a brand new startup inside our 108-year-old company. Maven has been operating in Chicago since last spring. So, to put it in perspective, in 1908, General Motors was born and the Chicago Cubs won the World Series. They didn't win it again until the year that Maven arrived in town. That's just one of the many reasons I expect this city to fully embrace Maven. Another reason is that Maven is fundamentally a great fit for Chicago. You have a lot of young professionals here adjusting to a car-free lifestyle. The city has great public transportation and very walkable neighborhoods. And when someone needs to use a vehicle to get somewhere, Maven is just around the corner. All you have to do is download the app and sign up. All of our vehicles have Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and all of the connectivity that our members need to easily access their music, messages, maps, contacts, and other information. Maven now has 3 product offerings, and they're all here in Chicago. The first one, Maven City Car Sharing, launched last April. So at more than 20 locations throughout downtown here in Chicago, there are about 45 vehicles to choose from Chevy Cruze to Cadillac Escalade, and of course everything in between in the fleet. This will cost you as little as $8 an hour or $64 a day, depending on the vehicle. And we're already up to 1,400 members in Chicago. The second offering is Maven Express Drive. This is an exclusive service for Lyft drivers who want to use one of our vehicles. Maybe they don't have their own vehicle or they don't want to use their own vehicle. So far in Chicago, we're up to nearly 1,700 members who have driven a combined 15 million miles in less than a year. Thirdly, Maven Home. This is where we partner with a building complex to keep a vehicle fleet on hand for residents to use. We're currently the Aqua building, where we have 800 residents have access to Maven vehicles. So far in Chicago, we've seen membership across Maven increase on average by about 23% per month. So we have very high hopes for the type of innovation that Maven represents. We have about 8,000 vehicles in the Maven fleet from coast to coast, and its members have driven them nearly 60 million miles in less than a year. So Maven is just a year old. You know what 1-year-olds can be like. They're disruptive, often petulant, sometimes not quite housebroken. But another thing that the typical 1-year-old does is grow and grow really fast, and that's what we expect from Maven. We think it's a great addition to the landscape as we transition towards this new transportation business model. At the same time, so in parallel with all of that, The largest and most profitable part of our business today is selling pickup trucks and SUVs. And that typically happens outside of the urban environment to commercial vendors or to fleet operators as well. And we don't think that business is going away anytime soon. It's going to be here for a long time. So as the part of the business that makes most of our money remains intact, it will help us to pursue other areas that will become increasingly important in the future. And we've created this really interesting intersection between rideshare, deep software capability, and massive industrial manufacturing scale, and the know-how to make cars. The assembly of those pieces together puts us in a very unique position to help define the future of mobility. And that future is fast approaching. So are vehicles that are cleaner, safer, smarter, more energy efficient, and as you've seen, soon to be driverless. I know skeptics remain, people who say, this will never happen. Well, I'm here to tell you it's happening already. Change is upon us. And as you Chicagoans all know, plenty of things that people said would never happen have happened. Thank you very much for your attention today, and I hope you have a great time at the show.
So, toughest question of the day. What kind of car do you drive?
Right now I have a Chevy Camaro ZL1, which is the highest performance version of the Camaro.
You drive it year-round, even in those Detroit winters?
Snow tires is the key.
Is it true that you grew up on a dairy farm in New Zealand?
That is 100% correct.
Town of 1,500 people?
Yeah, maybe less.
All right, so how did you go from there to pursuing investment banking at Morgan Stanley to then becoming president of a $160 billion revenue company? And you're only 44 years old. So please, don't be modest.
There was no central plan for this to be the outcome, I can tell you that. As you said, I grew up in New Zealand. I went to university down there. I joined the finance industry at a very local level, at the New Zealand level. For a few years, I got transferred to New York, and the idea, of course, was to stay for a year or two and then return, and then you get there and you stay there. And pursued that business for some time on Wall Street. Got involved with General Motors as a banker to the company at that time, was involved in the restructuring in 2009, and then joined the company shortly thereafter. So that's the nutshell edition.
So I've seen in previous presentations, you've mentioned that the auto industry will change more in the next 5 years than in the previous 50. So can you talk about what sort of disruption that will bring to the auto industry as well as perhaps other sectors throughout our economy?
Yeah, with all of us on the GM leadership team have made that comment, and we really think it's true. As I said, the business that we're in today, primarily of building and selling cars for sale to individuals and to corporate and fleet customers, that business has been operating that same way more or less for most of the history of the company. As we see change in customer behavior, customers wanting to consume their transportation, if you like, in a different kind of way, to not necessarily have to own the vehicle in order to use it, wanting more convenience, more flexibility, less cost, and so on. This is, the investments we're making in the future are not about, gee, we need to do something futuristic here. It's much more about where are our customers going, how are they behaving, what do they want us to do, and how can we best set ourselves up to meet their needs going forward. So we see the emergence of rideshare. It tells us something about what customers are looking for and what they're trying to do.
And what does the further future look like? Do cars become mobile offices that we just work and move around? When we go on vacation and do the tour of the Western U.S. national parks, do we see the Grand Canyon, and then at night go back into our car, which has a bed, and it drives us to Arches National Park the next day? I mean, what does the future look like?
You could get a job on our advanced design team. You could be, yeah, I think all of those possibilities. So it's pretty easy to let your imagination, run forward a little bit into what that could look like if you can do all of that and do it in a way that's much safer than the way that we're on the road today.
So with this change, I'm sure of the 200,000 employees, there are many that are embracing this change and really looking at it as an opportunity. But I would have to imagine that there's some employees that feel very comfortable with what has happened in the past. So how does GM create a culture that balances that future opportunity versus the peace of mind for their employees?
Well, I'd say at a very general level, the culture at General Motors today is one of putting the customer first and making sure we're going where the customers are going. And second, it's a culture to win. And for us to win as a company, for every employee in the company, we've got to be invested in where our customers are going, where the future's going. And I'd say, the amount of support and enthusiasm and excitement, from everybody inside the company, that we are putting the company in a position to not just participate in, but to lead and define the future of transportation is pretty exciting, and I think that excitement goes all through the organization.
So autonomous vehicles, when can I own an autonomous vehicle?
Individual autonomous vehicle ownership will be further out. We think the first application, logically, is inside of a shared fleet type environment. So think about a central city environment similar to the footage that I showed you there. So we think the first deployment of autonomous vehicles into rideshare happens relatively quickly here. We think individual AV ownership is further out on the horizon.
So you're talking a lot about rideshare with autonomous vehicles. I mean, what happens at the intersection of the two? I mean, as it is, Lyft is cheaper than a taxi in most cities. What happens once you take that driver out of the equation?
It gets safer and we think ultimately cheaper as well.
And will people just be able to order up whatever car they want? I mean, what do we do with parents who have children and they need car seats? Do you order up a car with a car seat?
You really do want a job in the advanced technology. Yeah, those are all things that we're thinking about and applications that we're thinking about. So the first objective is to get the technology to work and to work in the safest way possible, and that's what you saw, and that's what we're working on. Then you get to the use cases, and how do we enable the true customer experience? So if we go back to putting the customer in the center of what we're doing here, how do we enable that? So we have, all kidding aside, we of course have a team of people working through all of those scenarios, those use cases, understanding how does this actually work in the real world? How does the interaction between the customer and the vehicle change if there's no driver in the vehicle, so on and so forth. So there are a whole host of issues. You've identified a couple of examples of how this would need to work a bit differently than the way it works today.
So I think about leaders in the autonomous space, certainly General Motors, Tesla. I think of non-automotive companies like a Google or an Uber. So how does that work in terms of cooperation, competitiveness between these organizations?
Yeah, it's really interesting. If you wind the clock back maybe a year or two, there was no one, so far as we could tell, who had all of the pieces necessary to make this work. So if you think about large-scale industrial manufacturing capability on the one hand, deep software talent on the other hand, rideshare network is another piece of this. And so no one had all of those pieces together. And so what you've seen beginning to happen, some of the steps we've taken, alliance and investment in Lyft, acquisition of Cruise, the software technology capability. We've been setting ourselves up so that we have the full capability. You see other companies forming alliances and relationships. So I think it's pretty natural that we'll see more of that going forward.
So accidents do happen. It's rare, but sometimes the driver needs to choose between the safety and life of the passengers in her vehicle versus those on the road or the sidewalk. Just an incident. How does GM program ethics into their vehicle, into making those decisions of who to save?
So it's a great question. It's a question people like to talk about a lot. Let's take a step back from that first. The first step is, like I said in my remarks, 35,000 fatalities a year, 95+% human error. So if you look at the ability to make a fundamental impact on that through the basics of speeding, not drinking and driving, not distracted driving, seatbelt use, so on and so forth, and lack of driver error from an AV, potential AV point of view, we can fundamentally change at a very significant scale the overall level of safety. And so before you get to that individual use case and a particular sort of decision making around that, we need to start and look at the context of being able to make a fundamental and foundational difference to total safety.
You talked a little bit about utilization. 30% of the time people are looking for a parking spot and live in cities. What is the average utilization right now of a car, and where is it going to over the next 5 to 10 years?
Right now we estimate it's about 4%.
And where do you think we'll be 10 years from now?
Depends on the model. I think the current model will continue in a lot of use cases for sure for a long time. But at the same time, we can see autonomous vehicles operating in a shared fleet environment at a significantly higher utilization rate, and therefore you take the asset utilization up, you take the cost down, obviously.
So you're really challenging my common sense of what General Motors is. I think of General Motors as being an auto manufacturer, but I keep hearing these things around rideshare, increasing the utilization rates of vehicles. Is GM moving from a manufacturing model to a service model?
Well, one of the big changes we've made in the company over the last maybe 5 or 6 years is to take the philosophy and the mindset of putting the customer at the center of everything we do. So, what that does is it changes the way we make decisions, it changes the way we think about the business today, it changes the way we think about the business going forward into the future. So, if we see an opportunity to better serve our customers by providing a service, which is beyond just selling a vehicle, then that's absolutely something we'll explore.
So you talked about the states that you're testing in. I believe it was Arizona, California, Michigan. Why do you think those states have chosen to be so progressive on the autonomous vehicles?
Well, I think it's about the opportunity to improve transportation generally. It's about the opportunity for improved safety. It's about the opportunity of changing, in some ways, the urban landscape of how many vehicles need to be on the road. It's about congestion. It's about pollution. And so when you think a little bit more broadly about the impact that some of these changes that we're talking about here can have on the environment, broadly defined, I think a number of states and a number of cities want to be at the forefront of that change and finding out how to enable it and how to make it happen.
And states obviously have differing laws, countries have differing laws. How does General Motors work with state legislatures, local governments, state governments, federal governments to come up with some sort of uniform laws, or is that not that important?
We're working very closely with a lot of cities, states, and obviously the federal government. We believe deeply in what this technology can do, particularly the safety impact and how we can move that forward. And so we want to make sure that we create an environment in which we can develop the technology, deploy it in the safest possible way, and get on the path of making the difference and making some of the kinds of impacts that we talked about earlier.
You've mentioned safety many times concerning autonomous vehicles. I'm a parent as well as you are. You have 2 elementary school girls. So in terms of defining their safety, when would you feel comfortable putting them in an autonomous car? Yeah,
that's a good question. As I said in my comments, we're working on a safety validation program to get us to the point where we're absolutely ready to do that here as soon as we can.
Are we thinking 3 years?
2
years?
I couldn't tell you. I can't tell you.
Okay. President Trump has promoted spending on infrastructure. I would have to imagine road infrastructure plays a big part of how autonomous vehicles works. I don't know. I mean, do you see the auto industry playing a significant role in infrastructure?
Yeah, the perspective we've taken, I think clearly there's infrastructure investment required in the U.S. as a general matter. Roads, bridges, all of that. That's self-evident, I think. As it relates to autonomous vehicles, one approach would be to say that we need various infrastructure changes in order to enable the deployment of AVs. And the approach that we've taken is, actually, we can't wait for that. We need to make sure that the technology, as you saw it, we need to make sure that the technology is able to work and be deployed in the current environment so that we're not dependent upon some change in infrastructure or investment in infrastructure in order to do what we want to do here. Down the road, there may be opportunities for infrastructure improvements and so on, but we've decided that we need to be able to work inside of what's there currently to get this to go.
Mm-hmm. The administration keeps talking about U.S. jobs in the auto industry. How does GM meet this challenge while staying globally competitive?
So we have 100,000 employees in the United States. We have invested very significantly into the U.S. Over the last several years, tens of billions of dollars of investment into the country. We've grown jobs significantly. We've grown the business significantly here. We're investing in the future to drive the future success, not just of the company, but of the economy overall. So we're 100% invested in the success of the U.S.
We polled the Economic Club before the event, and we did get a few questions about your competitors. So one of the questions that we received...
You'll have to ask them.
One of the questions that we received was that Ford has been really successful with their new Ford GT high-performance car. How does GM plan to compete in the high end of the marketplace?
That is a question I cannot answer.
Okay. Next question. Volkswagen has had difficulties with their diesel emission tests. Any lessons to be learned from that? And how has GM changed its quality review procedures as a result of these problems?
Yeah, clearly that was the whole Volkswagen situation was a major event in the industry. I think every car company, I would imagine, has gone back and revalidated their own testing procedures and compliance and so on. And I think what that's led to is a conclusion that by and large the industry has been in decent shape. So I think that event gave rise to everyone to go back and look and understand. It's obviously given rise to a discussion on the regulatory side as to what, if anything, needs to change from that perspective. But I think you've seen sort of everyone go back and make sure that everything's in order.
I was in a Lyft a few weeks ago with a driver, and he was telling me about this program that GM is looking to roll out your fully electric vehicle, the Volt, to Lyft drivers, with part of the purpose being that passengers would be able to ask questions about the electric car, ask questions about the Volt, and the Lyft driver could be an ad for the Volt. Is that true, or is that his interpretation?
So we have a program, I mentioned it briefly, called Express Drive, where we provide vehicles for Lyft drivers. If they don't have a car or they don't want to use their own car, they can lease a car, short-term lease a car from us, and use that to drive for Lyft. And that program has been quite successful. Chicago was actually where we first started that program, and it's run inside of Maven. It's part of Maven, as I described it. And we've been really pleased with the success and uptake of that program. But it's also occurred to us that that's obviously an opportunity for both passengers and drivers to experience a General Motors vehicle that might not otherwise have a reason to be inside of one. So it gives us an interesting platform to give people a seats and seats kind of experience. And obviously that gives us an opportunity with vehicles like the Chevy Bolt or the Volt to do that kind of thing.
And do you think you'll be looking to roll out other fully electric vehicles?
Yeah, we see electrification as being a very significant part of the future, not just here in the US, but particularly in some other parts of the world. China will be probably the first market to go to very large scale electrification. So we see a heavy expansion of the EV portfolio over time.
So we keep hearing about these trends of electric vehicles, which are very quiet. You're taking the driver out of the driver's seat. How do you satisfy the customer who still wants the thrill of the road, who wants to be that driver?
We still got plenty of other cars for them to buy.
At the auto show today, besides the GM model, again, this is a question from a fellow Economic Club member, so can't answer this with any other GM model. Which new vehicles at the auto show are intriguing to you, and why?
I haven't been to the show yet, so I can't tell you. You like how I sneaked out of that one? That was great.
What other new trends do you see will excite new car buyers over the next few years?
We're in a very interesting time of significant change, even inside the sort of traditional car model. Big focus on connectivity, convenience, ease of use, bring my life outside my car, from my phone into the car, and have that be as seamless an experience as possible. I don't think the automotive industry has fully got all the way to to optimization on that. So I think there's still opportunities for improvement there. We were the first car company to roll, for example, CarPlay and Android Auto across at our range. That's one way to make that more convenient for customers. So connectivity and life outside the car, life inside the car, connection of that, we think is a big opportunity.
Can you talk a little bit about how President Trump can help more than the 200,000 employees of General Motors, and General Motors in specific?
How he can help, the company and the employees?
Yeah, the company and the employees.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we've, as I said, we've invested a lot and grown a lot in the US. We'd like to continue to do that. So obviously having a favorable environment in which to grow, having strong economic policies, growth supportive policies, anything that makes the economy good is good for business generally, not just our business. And if it's good for business, it'll be good for employment and good for everybody across the country.
Elementary school girls, do you think that they will have a need for a driver's license?
Probably.
Do you think your grandchildren will have the need for a license?
That's a more difficult question. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Now, there's two questions. Your question is, will they have a need? The other question is, will they have a desire? And so I think that, just be careful about which one of those I was answering there. So,
do you think grandchildren will have a desire?
Yeah, I think some will, for sure. Yeah.
Do you think there's going to be a difference between how rideshare and autonomous vehicles are used or needed in urban environments versus suburban and more particularly rural environments?
Yeah, I think for sure the use case will be different. The vehicles might be different. The natural starting point, of course, is the urban environment. That's where the density is greatest. It's where rideshare has started to become much more of a real thing today for all those reasons. So we think AV capability lends itself naturally to starting in that kind of environment. The challenge, of course, is the complexity of the environment. You saw a lot of that in the footage from San Francisco there today. Lots of strange things going on around you on the road. And it's a much more complicated environment to operate in than simply driving on a highway, for example. But we think that's where the demand is. That's where the first use case is in an urban area.
Last question. Let's finish where we began. Your boyhood home on a dairy farm in New Zealand, looking out your window of your bedroom, do you have a nicer view there or in your Detroit office, looking out the city of Detroit?
New Zealand countryside's pretty nice to look at.
Dan, thank you so much for speaking with us today. We really appreciate it.